Filler primer test part 2. You spoke, I listened, and we got the results here in part 2. So let's go. All right, what's up everyone? Back at it again. It is DW Darkwing Dad bringing you part 2 of the much anticipated filler primer test that I did with some pretty common filler primers that are out there. This test is nothing more than to kind of debunk some of the myths and see really which one is the best. And in part 2, we do some different tests here, really see how well these filler primers work as far as reactions, timing, sanding, how long you have to wait, things like that. So it really is a great test. We have some awesome results here. First things first, what we're going to do is we are going to recap where we stand from the first filler primer test we did. We're gonna get right into all the tests we have for part 2. So without further ado, let's check it out. And here's a look at the scores from the first round of testing. We have the 2 Rustoleums on the bottom, while the duplicolors are in second and third. Are they gonna catch Bondo? Let's see with our first test here. Let's go. The first test we have here is the dry to the touch test. It's pretty self-explanatory. All of these filler primers state that after a couple light coats properly applied, the filler primers can be handled in about 10 minutes. So what I did is went ahead and set my timer, kept an eye on my clock, and just applied a couple, light coats to the models, not too heavy, not too light, just keeping an eye on my clock. I'm really happy to state that every single one of these filler primers actually passed the test. Even the Krylon 2-in-1, which I stated in part 1, was super, super heavy and it was just really wet. So I was really happy to see that all of these actually passed this test. I even threw a curveball in there and did what was called a fingerprint test. Basically, after that 10 to 12 minute window that I let them sit, I just took my thumb and just applied a little bit of pressure on the model to see if it would leave a fingerprint behind. And every single one of these passed, which was really crazy because, like I said, some of these filler primers, the Duplicolor and the Krylon, they just came out really wet. But lo and behold, when you properly apply your filler primer and give them the right time, you'll have great results like this. Here's a couple choice words I have for when applying filler primer. Key is, guys, is when you're using these filler primers, light multiple coats. Of course, we want to get our projects done as soon as possible, but loading stuff on, caking stuff on, doing these heavy coats, you'll see in the abuse test that is not the way to go. It may fill things in, but you're gonna give yourself headaches because you're gonna have a ton of cure time, a ton of dry time. You're gonna be walking on pins and needles trying to sand this stuff. Light multiple coats, I am very happy to announce that all of these, which I think are really the most readily available filler primers, all fall within that 10 to 12 minute window. Let's see how quick we can sand these things and get them knocked down. All right, so now that we did the dry test, we are going to continue on with the recommended test, basically by going through and reading the back of these cans and seeing what they say. Some of them have very specific recoat times and sand times and what sandpaper to use and things like that. So we're just gonna go exactly off of what these cans say and see how they react. When I use filler primer, I like to start with 320 grit. So on some of these cans here, like the Duplicolor, it does mention 600 grit. What I am gonna do is throw a curveball in and try it with 320. So we're gonna still leave the time that each can is allotting. We're gonna try it with the recommended sandpaper, and I'm also gonna try my sandpaper, which I try, which is typically 320. The first pieces we're gonna spray though is Rustoleum. These can dry up to 4 hours. Nice and early in the day, it's about 10:30 in the morning, so we're gonna start getting some coats on all these pieces, letting them sit for the allotted time. Hit them with the required and recommended sandpaper, and then hit them with my choice of sandpaper and see how they do. So let's get going. All right, first things first, I want to give a shout out to Darkwing Z and thank him for letting me use his playground set to shelter somewhat of my pieces here. Here we're going to be spraying the 2 Rustoleums because these both need the longest time to dry. Test results allow 2 to 4 hours before dry sanding, and specifically says dry sanding. Same thing here, 2 to 4 hours before dry sanding. So first things first, let's get some coats sprayed on these. We'll let these sit and test these a little bit later, so let's go. Here we have the Duplicolor. So starting with the 2-in-1, if needed, sanding can be done wet or dry after 30 minutes with 600 grits. The Duplicolor refinish really does not state anything about any sort of time or what sandpaper to use. There's nothing on here. We are going to try to just wait that same 30 minutes. Same thing, we're gonna try 600 first and then 320. So let's get these sprayed real quick. We're just gonna call this one 1040 by the time I get the cans all shaked up. Bondo filler primer and the Krylon 2-in-1. Starting with the Bondo, very similar to the Duplicolor. You want to wait 30 minutes, and it states specifically 600 grit sandpaper. And with the Krylon 2-in-1, same thing here. You want to wait about 30 minutes, and it also does state 600 grit. So very interesting that a lot of these filler primers state that, because I always start with somewhere around 320, maybe 400. We're going to test it. We're going to go by what they recommend. So let's get these two sprayed here real quick. All right, so I've got these pieces here, the 4 that pretty much fall in that 30-minute window category. Just kind of sitting here. It's not too hot, but I know that the sun is going to help, and realistically, it is a factor. It would be awesome to do this test in like a cold area, but I don't live in the cold. Very important thing that, you know, if you don't have the proper temperatures, you're gonna wanna wait a lot longer. But, you know, given that it's around 70 degrees here, we got a little bit of sunshine, we're gonna let these sit here for about another 20 minutes. Let them dry and then go at sanding them. The Rustoleum pieces are sitting over here. I am gonna move those to the sun here temporarily, but those have you know, a lot longer to wait. We're gonna focus on these here. These have about another 20 minutes to set before we can sand them. I believe we can start sanding them sometime right around 11:15. Start hitting them with what they recommend and then kind of go from there. It is now 11:11. All brand new stuff here. New 3M sandpaper, sanding sponge. Sanding sponge, very important. We don't want to be putting too much force when we're sanding things. The reason why I like this is because you can still kind of have a feel for it. It's not super thick. I don't really like these really thick ones with curved ones. I like using these nice thin ones. So these ones are okay for wet sanding and flatter surfaces, but anything with a curve, I don't really like these very much. We're gonna start with the 2-in-1. We're using 600. Let's see how it reacts. First, it's completely dry. Sometimes when you lay stuff on too heavy, you can almost feel spongy. I don't feel that at all. So 30-minute mark, we're good to go. And it's sanding okay, it seems to be. We have dust, which is a very good indicator. If it clumps up, or you get a lot of residue, or there's really not a lot of dust being generated, that likely means your primer is still drying. It's going to give you issues, and we're actually taking some off here, so this is actually a really good sign. We do have some buildup on the sandpaper, but see how it just wipes right off. So you're going to have residue build up, but you don't want it clumping up. Clumping here, build up, so that's good. That means we have straight dust, and that's what we want to do, is try to level this down. But yeah, even on curves here, we can see that there's no clumping. Wipes right off, which is good. There is some very minor, so this is what I mean by clumping. So there's some very minor buildup here, and that might have been from getting in this little groove. Very minor, so it's not anything that you need to worry about. You definitely want to give your primer more time. So that's what I mean by clumping. Using the 600, the recommended 600 grit on the Duplicolor 2-in-1, seemed to work pretty well. I've got some fresh 320. I'm just gonna wrap it in this areas, like in here is where you'd want to hit it with 320. All these, you know, flatter areas, there's really no need to do 320 because you're just gonna strip it off. But for testing purposes, we're gonna do that. 320, and like I said, residue is gonna happen, but you don't want big heavy clumps. We do have some clumping right here, but it's pretty much the same, it's almost the same degree as the 600, so it's definitely not worse. But I'm not really seeing any crazy issues with using 320 either, which obviously is almost double as aggressive as 600. I would be more comfortable leaving it with about 45 minutes. It didn't do bad at 30. Is leave Duplicolor for maybe about 45 minutes. We're actually gonna let this sit for 15 minutes and see if it's a little bit better after then. We're gonna move on to the refinish. Now this didn't list any specific sandpaper, it just said to wait 30 minutes. So let's go ahead and sand this here and see how it works. Again, we're seeing dust, which is good. So we can definitely see here that there is a little bit more buildup with the refinish at 30 minutes. This is the clumping that we're seeing. So that is a prime indicator that the primer may not be fully dry and fully ready for sanding. So it's not bad, And if you get that, always inspect your model and see if there's any gouging, which I really don't. It's very smooth. So yeah, it's definitely clumping up a little bit more. You know, it could be something where it needs to wait more, so we're definitely gonna let this sit for another 15 minutes and see if it still does that or not. See how 320 reacts. So this is very interesting here now. So we have less clumping with the 320 than we did with the, you can see how much more clumped up with the 600 than the 320, so that's very interesting. A lot less clumping and a lot less buildup. There's some heavy ones here, which that's on an edge, and that can happen. That's just main point of contact. But based on, you know, compared to here, I feel like there's a little bit more buildup. It's not bad and it's not thick. Like you can barely even feel it in the sandpaper. So it's something that I wouldn't really worry about. If you get clumping like this, like I said, the biggest thing you want to do is check your model and see if there's gouging. You can see right here where I did it. There's no gouging. You actually see that there's almost a type of sheen, and that's with 320. There's no gouging or anything, so it is sanding down and it is doing a good job. Move on to the Bondo and the Krylon, which were definitely at the 30-minute mark here. You can see it's 11:23. I'm gonna hit the Bondo filler primer first with the 600. See how it does. And no clumping, no residue, nothing from Bondo filler primer. Absolutely flawless. So you can see here how we had buildup with the Duplicolor. There is absolutely nothing on the Bondo side of things. And again, no major clumping. There is residue, which like I said, we're gonna have, but there is no clumping at all with the Bondo filler primer. No issues with the Bondo. That is 100% pass right there. That 30-minute window, it is absolutely flawless, so we are good to go. On to the Krylon 2-in-1. We're gonna use that 600 side again. Let's take a look here. And a little bit of residue, very, very minor. It's not heavy. It's just some of the residue that's kind of being embedded in the sandpaper. So really no issues there. But yeah, I mean, like I said, there's some very minor residue, but it's not really clumping. So really the only one that's showing clumping right now was the Duplicolor refinish, which is kind of shocking. Try the 320. So now we see a little bit of clumping. So that's what I mean by clumping. It could need more time, or this is just too aggressive of a sandpaper for this particular filler primer. So this is one of those scenarios where Krylon is a water-based filler primer, and understand that means it's gonna be more delicate. It's gonna be a little bit more soft. We're gonna let these 4 pieces sit here for another 10 minutes, see if there's still some clumping after they've had a little bit more time to dry. All right, it is now 11:32, so we've given these about an extra 15, 20 minutes to sit. A little bit of clumping there, so really no crazy change on the Duplicolor when we let it sit longer. Let's try 320. And really no major change there with the Duplicolor. Either. It's still just some very, very minor clumping. This is the Duplicolor that we used before, so pretty much the same results even after letting it sit. You know, very, very minor clumping. You know, hopefully you can see that sheen, that shine. It's not being gouged, it's being leveled out. So refinish. Now this was the one that clumped the most, and I would say it's not as bad. There still is some minor clumping here, but I don't think it's as bad as that. This is the initial one. You can see there's definitely a lot more. Not as bad. There's definitely a lot less. So it's very smooth. The clumping I wouldn't over worry about because it's so minor, but pretty nice. So an extra 15 minutes seems to actually do some justice to the Duplicolor. So we're gonna use the opposite side of the 600 here. Let's start with that and see how it looks. Again, same thing, some light residue, but really no major clumping or anything. So a big improvement. Again, you're always going to have some, you're more likely to get buildup on the side because that's where the curve is, and that's where basically more topical friction is induced, is on these edges and on these corners. That's just kind of like common sense. But we don't have anywhere near as much. I mean, you can see here, this was like the flatter area. Again, though, you can see the sheen and the shine with the 600. So with 600, it was quite all right. But if you're going down and you need to get more aggressive and knock down, PLA gaps and things like that, definitely give yourself more time. It's never a bad thing to give yourself more time than less. But overall, a nice improvement there, letting it sit an extra 15 minutes, especially if you're going with a more aggressive sandpaper. 12:37, so about 2 hours and 2 minutes since we sprayed the Rustoleum. See if the 2-hour window will work. And we've got dust, which is good, but look at how much is building up on this. That is quite a bit. This is kind of showing that the primer is not fully dry. If you have a little bit of clumping, it's okay to an extent, but this is, I mean, this is a little bit of clumping. This is a ton. This is a lot. This is showing that the primer is soft, and I mean, these are big, heavy clumps. Like, we don't want that, like, to the point to where, see how you can like peel them off? So that's not good. It is sanding and it's being smooth, but the problem with this is when you have an underlying primer that clumps like this and it's potentially still wet, when you put paint and clear coat on, you're gonna have a bad reaction. So let's see what that does. So we'll hit this side here because we haven't hit this side yet. And that is absolutely terrible. That is really bad. Destroyed sandpaper. Like, this is clumped up so bad. This is what you don't want. You can see here that this stuff is not dry because I'm able just to peel it right off. Like, it's still like flexible. Not looking too hot for the Rustoleum 2-in-1. This was the side. This is bad. I mean, that's, I was iffy about this with the Duplicolor, but look at that. That's bad. And this was 2 hours versus 30 minutes. See, this is the regular filler primer, Rustoleum. Let's hit this with the 600. See if there's any difference. And pretty much the same thing. Maybe not quite as bad, maybe a little bit less. You can see the 2-in-1 just clumps up like crazy. It's still fairly heavy, but not as bad. But it's still showing, clumping, which is not ideal. Just indicates a soft substrate is still present in uncured paint. The 320. And then obviously looking at the sandpaper here, we run into the same issue. This was the 2-in-1. This is the regular Rustoleum filler. When you're sanding a filler primer, this is just clear indicator that it is not ready to be sanded. The 2-hour window on the Rustoleum, that is a no-go. We have to let these sit for about another 2 hours. I'll see you around 3 o'clock. It is now 2:54. The Rustoleum 2-in-1 and just the Rustoleum filler primer. 600, and it's gonna be because it's a finer sandpaper. So we have dust, more dust than before. So that is a pretty good indicator. See, this was from before, so it's definitely a lot less. So still some clumping, not quite as bad though, but still areas for concern. Knee piece here, and we're gonna hit that and see how it looks, which is good. That's obviously what we want. It doesn't feel as abrasive as before, and really not as bad. So what I'm noticing is the Rustoleum filler, it has almost the same amount of filling ability, but it doesn't clump as bad. I kind of went right here, and it's a lot lighter than what the 2-in-1. This was the 2-in-1, and you can see it's just everywhere, and it was right here is where I use it, and it's just not quite as bad. The sandpaper, it's gliding, I guess you could say, easier, and the dust it's not clumpy. Whereas before I felt like I was stripping it off. This I feel like I'm actually leveling it down. 320 actually has less clumping than the 600. So again, this is why you kind of have to test and see what is going to work. I mean, right here with this Rustoleum filler, I mean, that's very, very small amounts of clumping, almost to an acceptable state. It's not terrible, but it's a lot better than the 2-in-1. I'm going to give a final grade on these. Like I said, these are not two of mine at choice, just because, I mean, we're at 4 hours here. That's kind of ridiculous. Still having some issues with the 2-in-1. The regular filler isn't as bad, but let me wrap this up, grade these, score these. We'll go over this whole test, and then we're going to move on to the abuse test, where we really load these on and see how they react. All right, Duplicolor 2-in-1. As stated, it passed the dry to the touch test perfectly with the 10. There were no issues there. The manufacturing sanding test, so basically letting that sit for about 30 minutes and then sanding it with the 600 and then my choice 320, it did pretty well. I feel it does need a little bit more time. Around that 45-minute to 60-minute mark seemed to be kind of more of a sweet spot. So although it didn't do bad, there was minor clumping, it still did sand pretty good. Overall, I'm giving the manufacturer sand test on the Duplicolor 2-in-1 a rating of 7.5. Next, the Bondo Filler Primer. The dry test passed with flying colors. As I stated, this is lacquer based. It dries the quickest anyways. Absolutely no issues there. With the recommended sanding settings from the manufacturer, didn't matter what I threw at it. 600, 320, this thing sanded flawlessly. No gouging, no clumping, nothing. Absolutely perfect. Giving that a 10 out of 10. The Rustoleum 2-in-1, again, it passed the dry to the touch test, no problem. That gets a perfect score of 10. However, the manufacturer settings, even going based off of what they said, we tried it at 2 hours, we tried it at 4 hours, we tried 600, 320 was absolutely gouging it up and just clumping it up and everything. This stuff needs a lot of time. It can't be put on heavy. It's very finicky and very sensitive. I'm not really a fan of this. It's just a challenge with this stuff. Who knows what happens when you put paint on? And I think a lot of people have issues once they put paint on, because this filler primer just isn't fully cured. It takes way too long. It slows you down. It can backtrack you. Because of all these variables and uncertainties, I'm giving a total score of 4.5. And now just the regular Rustoleum filler primer. Again, the dry test, perfect at 10 minutes, no issues there, so that gets a 10 out of 10. The manufacturer sanding settings, again, just like the 2-in-1, this needs a lot of time. I don't feel this needs quite as much time as the 2-in-1. I think out of the 2-in-1 can fill more, but it needs more time. Honestly, close to 5 or 6 hours. I think the Rustoleum filler primer, this stuff, it didn't have as much clumping, not as much buildup, but still, it's water-based, it clumps, it's going to slow you down. Not really a big fan of it. I think between 5 hours, it would be okay to sand. However, based on just the time it consumes and just how it's gummy and just kind of clumps up, I'm giving an overall score on the sanding test of a 5. Krylon 2-in-1. Again, the dry to the touch test, a perfect score of 10. There was no issues there. The manufacturer sanding setting. So honestly, I was pleasantly surprised by this. If I went to the store and there was Rustoleum or Krylon to choose from, I would choose Krylon. You've seen that it sanded pretty good at 600, very similar to the Duplicolor, but then it did great at the 320. So even though it sprays out a little bit heavier, a little bit wetter, as I state, it actually sanded pretty good. I was pleasantly surprised at how well this sands down. Once you can get a control of how to, control that flow of how it sprays out, it's really not that bad of a filler primer. So overall, with the manufacturer sanding test, I'm actually giving Krylon 2-in-1 a score of an 8. And lastly, the Duplicolor refinish. Again, the dry to the touch test, no problem, 10 out of 10 there. The directions were a little bit vague with the manufacturer sanding test, but I looked online and found out it's basically the same settings as a Duplicolor 2-in-1. So with that 30-minute window, it performed okay. There was still some buildup on the 600 grit and a little bit on the 320. So I think this is something where it needs closer to an hour, and you should have better results sanding. Still a great filler primer though, solvent-based, dries pretty fast. The overall manufacturer sanding test for this, I'm giving it a score of a 7. Here we are moving into the self-filling ability and the torture test. For this, I'm going to be using some different pieces. These are some scrap pieces from my Punisher War Machine suit. The reason why I don't want to use the existing feet pieces, one, they're way too smooth. So to try to see self-filling ability when most of the PLA lines have already been knocked down, not an ideal candidate for this. These pieces here, there is zero sanding, so we're really going to be able to see which one self-fills the best without any sanding. Also, the torture test, I don't want to mess these pieces up because these are the actual pieces I'm using on the suit. So if I load a bunch of filler primer on here and I can't get it off, or it gunks up, or something goes bad, these pieces could ultimately be ruined, which I don't want. And no sanding, I'm not doing any sanding. We want to see what filler primer fills this in the best. And then we also want to torture these and see, even if we load this filler primer on, can these filler primers dry? Can they be sanded? Things like that at a decent amount of heat, but not too much heat. So let's get started on these tests. Let's go. All right, so here you can see I have these pieces all set up with what we are applying in arrows showing to what. What I'm gonna do is I'm going to apply 3 layers of each filler primer. Play it safe, even though it's nice and sunny. We'll probably play it safe and just do 20 minutes in between each layer. But what we're gonna do is we're gonna do 3 coats, let it sit, 3 coats. We're gonna repeat it 3 times, but 9 coats total, and see how well these fill. So, imperfections, PLA line, things that we'll see. So we're really gonna see how well these filler primers fill. So let's get spraying some filler primer on these. This is 24 hours after doing our little self-filling test. So again, we have the Rustoleum 2-in-1, the Rustoleum filler, the Krylon 2-in-1, Bondo filler primer, Duplicolor 2-in-1, and just regular Duplicolor refinish. Out of the 3, I would say that Krylon actually has the best filling ability at how well it actually fills these in with no sanding, you know, versus the Rustoleum filler. And then even the Rustoleum 2-in-1, you can still see that there are just some areas. We'll say the Krylon is very runny. It's watery. I don't know how well you can tell, but you can see how there's a little bit of a run because I had the piece like this and it was kind of angling this way. So you can see that, you know, the last coat I did on this, I did do a little bit thicker. Not really. I mean, there's a little bit of running you can see right here from the Rustoleum 2-in-1. I would say in 3rd place here, you know, on this one for sure is definitely going to be just the Rustoleum filler primer. I would give a 2nd place to the Rustoleum 2-in-1, and honestly, I think the Krylon filled in the best. These are all of the solvent-based fillers, and that's why I kind of did this, because I was trying to gauge it fair. Bondo filled in really good. Duplicolor, you know, comparing these side by side, look how much better Duplicolor filled in than Rustoleum. Substantially. You can still see lines and gaps. On here you cannot. These are pretty much all, you know, sealed off. I mean, the general filling ability is just without any sanding is pretty crazy on all 3 of these. How smooth. I mean, that filled in a ton of stuff. And the same thing with the Duplicolor, you know, filled in quite a bit. The standard Duplicolor filler, even that, I mean, these are some heavy, right here are some heavy gaps that they filled in a ton. I say that the Duplicolor 2-in-1 might have taken this one away, and the Bondo is close. And it was tough on some of these areas because I didn't want these to overlap. So like right here, I didn't really spray it hard. The Bondo definitely filled in really good. One of these that you go with are going to be absolutely fantastic. But again, don't sleep on that Krylon. The primer is runny, so you have to do very light coats. So what I'm gonna do is kind of prep these. I'm gonna get some fresh tape on here and get ready to do some torture tests and see how they hold up. Before we torture these, let's rate the filling ability of the filler primers. First, starting with the Rustoleum 2-in-1. As stated in the past, it is a water-based filler primer, and it does come out a little bit heavy, a little bit thick, so it doesn't surprise me that it does have some decent filling ability, which it does. You can see here that there are still some gaps in some areas that it didn't fill in quite that well, but it still did an overall pretty good job. Considering the condition of the non-prep piece and the filling ability it shows, I'm giving Rustoleum 2-in-1 a score of 7.5. Now moving on to Rustoleum Filler Primer, the non-2-in-1. So you'll definitely be able to see here that this filler primer just doesn't have as heavy of fillers as the 2-in-1. So this is a real nice comparison. You can see a lot of those PLA lines are very visible. It still did an okay job considering the piece, but definitely didn't fill in quite as good as the 2-in-1. So considering the piece, the final results here that we can see a lot of those gaps in the PLA, I'm giving the Rustoleum a 6.5. All right, the Krylon 2-in-1, again, another water-based filler primer. I was pleasantly surprised with this one. You can really tell looking at this piece, it filled in a majority of the PLA lines, a lot better than the Rustoleum, and then a little bit better than the Rustoleum 2-in-1. No major runs. You can see that everything is sealed off here. Really solid piece, given a score of an 8. All right, now next on to the next piece, and Duplicolor Refinish first on the list. Did a pretty solid job of filling, considering some of the gaps that were there, how it kind of went on that curve, and the print had some really deep PLA gaps in there. It filled it out really good. Overall, you can still see the PLA lines a little bit, but considering how bad the piece was, I'm giving Refinish a score of an 8. Duplicolor 2-in-1. So a very similar story to the Rustoleum 2-in-1 versus the regular filler. You can see here a quick side-by-side. You can see how that 2-in-1 is filling in those PLA lines just a little bit better. Not by leaps and bounds, but definitely has some better filling ability. So based on how the product looks at the end here, its ability to fill, I'm giving the Duplicolor 2-in-1 a score of an 8.5. And lastly, the Bondo Filler Primer, which may have had the roughest part of the whole piece to kind of fill in. You can see there's just a bunch of impurities in the piece here, but look how flat and how smooth it actually made that area right there. To me, that is pretty impressive. So the Bondo did a great job of filling, even despite how rough the piece was. Overall, I'm matching it with the Duplicolor at an 8.5. All right, so here after I sprayed the panels, this is the Krylon and the 2 Rustoleums. What I noticed is out of the 3, the Rustoleum 2-in-1 had the least amount of running. Put them on pretty thick, so you can kind of see this one didn't run too bad. The Rustoleum filler primer, I did put that, the non-2-in-1, I did put that on pretty heavy. I can guarantee we're gonna have some issue sanding right there and right there. That's probably gonna clump up. Krylon, it ran a little bit, but not too bad. You can see right there we have a run. It is a little bit of a smaller area, so that's bound to happen. But out of the 3, like I said, this one's definitely the most watery, but filled, you know, still really good. I think out of the 3, I think the Krylon will sand okay. These 2 are probably gonna clump up, or we'll see how those hold up after they sit for about 2 hours. All right, so moving on to the Bondo and the 2 Duplicolors. Some minor running on the Bondo side that may have been from the nozzle. Typically, any primer that you load on it can run. Usually, Bondo is pretty good. So the Bondo is completely dry here, or at least drier than the Duplicolors. Now, I wouldn't say completely dry, but you can see there's no shine or sheen. These 2 are still very wet. Duplicolor Refinish, it ran the least. Really no runs on this, and I kind of tried to put it on a little bit heavier just to see if it would run, and it didn't. So this test is actually kind of showing to me that the Refinish is actually a little bit thicker than the Duplicolor. You can see here that we had some runs. I'm gonna let these sit. They're just in my shed. And these with a light 320, something not too aggressive, just to see how they work out. So we're gonna let these dry and pop back in an hour. All right, so back at it with the test. So I am doing some sanding just to test it. You can see I have a little sponge in here, and I'm just using 320. I'm not using anything too crazy. I did wait a little bit longer. I waited about an hour and a half. We're going to start with the Rustoleum. First, I'm going to start with sanding the Rustoleum 2-in-1, just something light just to see how it does. So I can kind of tell already it's starting to get some buildup here. So you can kind of see how it's getting gouged. You can definitely tell that it's still a little moist still. It feels spongy. So, and you can actually tell right there because I gouged it. I gouged it right there with the sandpaper. Definitely not ready. You can also tell by the sandpaper here, it is starting to build up. The Rustoleum filler primer. This is not the 2-in-1. This is just the regular. And kind of the same scenario. You can just feel that it's kind of spongy. And another way you can tell too, and I'll test on both of these, is I'm just gonna push with my fingerprint and look what it just did there. So you can tell. So you might sit there and say, hey, that was getting sanded down, it was looking good. Look what just pushing with my fingerprint did there. And look at what it did there. You can tell it's not. And a lot of people make the mistake of doing a super, super light sandpaper. Like they load the filler primer on and then they think, oh, it's cool. And then they paint it and all those heavy solvents react. All the underlaying solvents that aren't cured. And you get wrinkling, you get frying. Here on the Krylon, before we even, not so much. Still a little bit, but it's nowhere near as bad as the Rustoleum. So not so much on the Krylon, a little bit. Try to sand this down a little bit. I'm probably gonna have to get another piece of sandpaper here because this is already getting all gunked up because these aren't fully dry. So yeah, they all kind of like react the same. They get this sheen and shine to them because in essence, you're almost like polishing it. You're not really smoothing it out. It's such a light sandpaper. If we were to take something heavy, and I'll kind of show you real quick right here, I'm just gonna go up to 220. And again, this is used sandpaper, so this doesn't even have as much bite as, it normally would. But, with this, if you go over it with this, you can see how it's just creating these gouges, and that is a prime. And you shouldn't gouge filler primer with 220. It should, if anything, it should be very minuscule. It shouldn't be bad, but you can see. Hopefully, you can see there. Look at those. The amount of scratches they're putting in is just insane. Of course, you can see the buildup on here. It's a prime example showing that it's not yet dry. It's not yet ready to sand. The Krylon is probably the driest, but it's still getting some of these scratches here from the 220. So that's one of these three are really past this initial hour and a half test. There's still quite a bit to go. So we got to let those sit for a little bit. I'm gonna move on to the Bondo filler primer, Duplicolor 2-in-1, and the Duplicolor refinish. I'm just gonna jump right in with these. I'm just gonna go at 220 with them and see what they do instead of trying to be, this is a torture test. So let's see what these things do with 220. So right off the bat here, we're seeing dust, which is great. That means it is dried and primarily mostly cured. There shouldn't be a whole lot of gouging, and I'm not using a sanding sponge here, so I'm breaking one of my own rules. But again, this is a torture test. But I mean, you can see here, no issues. This is sanding. You can see how it's bringing out the defects. Bondo is a lacquer-based filler primer, so it dries and cures super quick. No buildup on that sandpaper. So this definitely passed the torture test in my eyes already, just because you can sand it right away. Definitely passes the initial test. Let's move on to the Duplicolor 2-in-1. Again, trying to use a fresh spot here. And we do have a little bit of dust, but not a lot. So it's a little spongy. I'm a little bit surprised by that because the Duplicolor is a solvent-based, meaning it can contain things like acetone or alcohols, things that help evaporate and dry quicker. We do have a little buildup here on the towel, and again, you can see how it's got that sheen to it. I didn't do this with the fingerprint test. So on the Bondo, nothing there. On the Duplicolor, very faint. And that's because I think it was put on heavy, so very faint. So that's a prime indicator that, yeah, it is still a little bit wet. Oh, yeah, wow, that one. So this is still really wet right here on the refinish. So let's see how this sands here. We're going to go over here. And you can see that it is gouging. So this is definitely a filler primer that does not like to be applied heavy. This is almost reacting the same as the Rustoleum, so, which I'm a little shocked by because, again, it's a solvent-based primer, and it is known to dry quicker. Definitely has nice filling abilities, low run, but that's crazy that it is still that wet. I mean, to where I can look at it, I mean, I can reshape this and peel this off. So something interesting there between those two. So what I want to do is let these sit for another hour. Let's come back and see how they bounce back. Results from the torture test, the Rustoleum 2-in-1. I actually had to wait 15 hours before I could sand these. I did the two Rustoleums last. So, you know, at 15 hours, they were finally able to be sanded to some degree. They were producing dust. They weren't gouging too bad. They kind of performed the way Rustoleum filler primer normally performs. Biggest thing is that thumbprint test right there. It passed it. It is no longer spongy. It's not leaving, you know, any fingerprint behind. So it actually was completely gassed out. We were able to dry it. We were able to sand it, get a somewhat decent result considering how heavy that filler primer was put on. Based on these results, the 15-hour wait time, I'm giving the 2-in-1 a total score of 5. Rustoleum filler primer, very similar story to the 2-in-1. We waited about 15 hours. After that time allotted, you can see here, it did pass the fingerprint test. We were finally able to get some decent sanding done here to produce some dust. So as far as the Rustoleum filler primer goes, I'm giving that a rating of 5 as well. All right, so the Krylon 2-in-1 throwing me for a surprise here. At the 4-hour window, it completely passed the fingerprint test. No imprint left behind. It did not feel spongy. Pretty crazy considering this is a water-based filler primer. But overall, at 4 hours, we were able to sand it, get a good amount of dust produced, no gouging, very minimal clumping. Like I said, a very pleasant surprise from this Krylon. So with all that said, on the torture test here, we're giving it a rating of a 7.25. Now the Duplicolor 2-in-1, very similar to the Krylon at the 4-hour window there, passed the fingerprint test, no problem. We were able to start sanding it, get a good amount of dust residue built up and everything. A little bit more clumping than the Krylon, but overall it bounced back very well. For all those reasons and more, I'm giving the Duplicolor a score of 7 on the torture test. All right, now the Duplicolor refinish. If you're ready for a surprise, here it is. Even at the 14-hour mark, there were some areas on the print that were still showing signs of my fingerprint when I did the fingerprint test. I don't know how well you can see it there, but some areas it did pass. Other areas, there were still little traces of fingerprints. When sanding, some areas it would clump up really bad. Other areas it would sand, you know, somewhat decent. Pretty shocking considering this is a solvent-based filler primer, but overall, because it lacked to uniformly kind of cure and all kind of come together on this torture test here for the Duplicolor, I'm giving a score of a 4. And now finally the Bondo filler primer. So this one, if you didn't see, it passed with flying colors. So we loaded this on to where there were runs and it was just caked on there, and we were able to sand this down, as you can see here, with dust, with no clumping, with no damage, no residue, with 220 grit, and had absolutely no issues at an hour and a half, which is absolutely insane considering these other ones needed 4 hours and then even some 14 hours to get sanded down. So no surprise here, the Bondo filler primer passing with flying colors, giving this one a rating of a 10 out of 10 on the torture test. And now it's time to look at the results from the Part 2 testing. In 6th place with a score of 6.62 was the Rustoleum filler primer. In 5th place with a score of 6.75 was the Rustoleum 2-in-1 filler primer. With a score of 7.25, dropping a few spots, was the Duplicolor refinish. Next, dropping a spot down to 3rd was also the Duplicolor 2-in-1 with a total score of 8.25. In 2nd place, which was a pretty big surprise in this test here, was the Krylon 2-in-1 filler primer with a score of 8.31. And on top was once again the Bondo filler primer with a total score of 9.25. So now that the Part 2 scores are tallied and we have everyone ranked, let's combine those with the Part 1 testing and see who came out on top. And here we go with the final results. In 6th place, Rustoleum 2-in-1 filler primer with a 6.62 score. In 5th place, the Rustoleum standard filler primer, swapping spots at a 6.68. Duplicolor refinish, a little bit of a surprise, falling a few spots, 7.32. Jumping up, Krylon 2-in-1, wow, 7.60 score. In 2nd, Duplicolor 2-in-1, close but not close enough, 7.87, making our grand winner today the Bondo filler primer with a score of 8.57. All right, guys, well, that's it. That is my test of the filler primers. The reason I chose all these filler primers is because they're pretty adequately available. I know the Bondo, it can be difficult to get, but a lot of Ace hardwares do carry it. It is a great filler primer. Yes, it is a little bit pricey, but the time that it saves you, just the overall quality to me is second to none. Duplicolor, another great filler primer. Krylon, really a big surprise. If you are looking for a budget filler primer, Sand's a lot better than the Rustoleum. Really, guys, give it a shot. It really isn't a bad filler primer. However, I am just so used to Bondo. There's no mystery why it came out on top. You've seen that abuse test. I mean, I loaded that on to where it was running and it sanded flawlessly at an hour and a half. Not to sleep on the Duplicolor. That is available at a lot of O'Reilly's and some auto parts stores. Duplicolor refinish, that kind of let me down a little bit. The initial manufacturer sanding test, it fared pretty well, but it does not like to be put on heavy. So that's why I did these tests, guys. The self-leveling test, the abuse test, just little things like that, just different things that maybe some people don't try with their filler primers, but I thought it would be good to see. And ultimately, these all can work, you know, somewhat well. It really just comes down to budget, your expectations, you know, availability. A ton of people use Rustoleum. A lot of people like it. A lot of people hate it. Water-based filler primers breed all kinds of problems if you don't give them enough time. So I like to kind of nullify that and go with the solvent or the lacquer-based fillers, i.e. the Duplicolor and the Bondo. I think any one of those three that you go with, give enough time in between, I think you're going to have great success. But really with anything, guys, we definitely don't want to do what we did in that abuse test and load those filler primers on. Sure, they'll fill, but you're going to be ripping your hair out trying to get those to sand, and you're going to have reactions when you're putting top coats on, and it's just not going to be a bad time. So always remember, guys, whichever filler primer you're going with, light multiple coats is really the best way. Give them more time than less, and all your prints should come out pretty awesome. If you like this video and you enjoyed what you've seen today, go ahead and give me a thumbs up. Of course, you're all going to have opinions. Go ahead and let me know. I'm not going to knock you if you're using Rustoleum or Krylon, whatever you're using. Go ahead and drop me a comment. Let me know what you're using, how you're liking it. If you have tips for others, please share so we can all help each other out on this page. If you're a subscriber to the channel, thank you so much. I know you guys were waiting for this video for like 3 months now. I hope you see why it took so long. There was just tons of footage, just certain visuals. I had to show you guys the clumping, the dusting, just wanted to get right in there and show you. Hopefully all my subscribers enjoyed this video, so thank you so much for tuning in. If you're not a subscriber to the channel and you love all things 3D printing, cosplay, Marvel, Funko collectibles, go ahead and click that subscribe button. I got a lot more builds. Thanos, Punisher, War Machine, Moon Knight. I got a lot of cool updates coming. So if you like any of that stuff, go ahead and click that subscribe button. Obviously, if you guys have questions on anything, just drop me a comment in the comment section. You know I'll reply back. If you're on the Discord, you can go ahead and shoot me a message there. Or if you want, just drop me an email. All of my information is in the description box. Hopefully this test showed you a little bit, taught you a few things about these filler primers, what to do, what not to do. Like I said, any and all questions, guys, just drop me a comment and let me know. That's it for now, guys. I'm going to go get working on Thanos. That's going to be the next video up. Until next time, DW out. Later.